My wife Pam and I willingly rented a picturesque house on a quiet lake and imagined a week-long blissful trip, but little did we know that our happy journey was about to take a huge turn for the worse. Even though it was only noon on a Monday, the trip had already begun. Our friends Bill and Carol, who had also rented the house next door, were soon to arrive. Let me introduce myself from the beginning. My name is Frank, my wife's name is Pam, we are both in our mid-30s and have been married for 8 years. When we first met, I was a senior in college and Pam was a junior. Additionally, my wife Pam found a job after our marriage and her income was instrumental in keeping us afloat during the first few years of our financial difficulties. Due to financial constraints, we decided to delay having children and made efforts to use birth control. I was deeply mesmerized by her exquisite beauty. The weather was perfect, so we didn't waste time unloading and organizing the house. Just then I noticed a gentleman drive up to the neighboring house where our friends Bill and Carol were soon staying. He soon came out with a beer in his hand. I was intrigued by this sight and decided to investigate the situation, so I approached him and after introducing myself, I found out that his name was Joe, that he was about 2 centimeters taller than I was, that he weighed about 50 kilograms, and that he had the strong physique of a rugby player. He told me that he belonged to a group of people who owned a spacious villa on a lake about 10 miles from the city, but since the villa he was going to live in had not yet been built, he was staying in it temporarily until Monday. I introduced them to each other and couldn't help but notice Joe's overly friendly demeanor with Pam, as if he was undressing her with his eyes. I wasn't particularly interested in Joe, so after finishing my beer I suggested that we end the conversation for the night. I quickly undressed and slipped under the covers. Pam went to the bathroom and when she came back she was in her robe. The next morning I woke up to find that it was still dark outside the window. I glanced at the clock and it showed the time to be 4:30 a.m. This fitted in nicely with my plan and I quickly went to the bathroom. I was in the shower. I had to go to the bathroom. 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 After washing up I went back to bed and gently woke Pam up, told her we had an important fishing trip and sent her to the kitchen to make coffee while I took a quick shower. Oddly enough, Pam didn't turn on the light and just as I was about to do so, she whispered eagerly, "Don't turn on the light, I'm curious." This got Pam's attention and I didn't say a word to her, after which I made coffee for both of us. Pam was going to take a shower and I told her to get dressed and wait for me at the dock. As I walked down to the lake, I was overcome with a sense of calm that allowed me to fully immerse myself in the process. This time of day has always been my favorite time of day because the heat of the day hadn't set in yet and the lack of wind created an atmosphere of serenity. I took Pam by the arm and set up her rod, making sure everything was in place for her to enjoy the fishing. I sat in the middle seat and threw my paddle into the calm water, putting us about 50 feet from shore. 2 hours later, we were back at the dock, but Pam's fishing wasn't a success. She only caught 1 fish while I caught 3 nice ones that would make a nice lunch. In addition, she encountered many obstacles as she got tangled in the water 3 times and even got her line tangled in a branch from the bank. After securing the boat, I asked Pam to get me a beer while I cleaned the fish. As we finished a nice dinner with a refreshing cold beer, I felt a sense of satisfaction. I playfully teased her that I would like to see him again, to which she replied with slight annoyance that she was going out in the sun and if I wanted to take a nap let me 00 up. I hurriedly got up and went to look for Pam. At last I saw her laying on a blanket at the back of the house. As I approached her I realized that she was dozing off just as I was. Her skin was a little reddened by the sun, so I gently woke her up and suggested that she get sunburned before she find a shady spot before she got sunburned. She suggested I go fishing alone and promised to make me dinner when I returned. Determined to spend my time where it would be useful, I went to the opposite shore of the lake, where a majestic pine forest stretched to the water's edge with few resorts. After enjoying dinner and helping her with the dishes, we decided to relax on the balcony and were not surprised when Pam broached the subject of intimate fantasies. I admitted that I had fantasized about making love to her, but she surprised me by asking if I had any desires related to other women. I don't want to destroy our marriage, I want us to grow old together, but I also have a fantasy that I want to fulfill and I'm asking you to allow me to spend one night with Joe tonight, after which he'll be out of our lives forever. She said that if you really loved me, you'd want me to have everything I want. I understand that you don't want me to fulfill my only fantasy, which is to spend the night with Joe. Our love won't change. Our friends Bill and Carol will be there tomorrow night and they won't know about our meeting. Yes, she said, I've made up my mind, I'm going to do it because I'm sure if you really love me you'll let me do it. We argued heatedly for another 30 minutes, but I couldn't convince her. As dusk fell, Pam looked around Joe's cabin and noticed that he was taking a walk around the neighborhood, and after convincing me to get in the car, she insisted that I park nearby and walk back to the cabin without turning on the lights and spend the night there. As I pulled onto the beltway and passed near the resort, tears came to my eyes and my vision became blurry. The distance between our cabin and the back door was about 70 yards to a wooded area. I walked into the cabin and collapsed on the bed, wondering if I would have the strength to stand up. All I can say is that it finally dawned on me that even though we had been married for 8 years, I really didn't understand what kind of person Pam really was. 30 a.m. She was due back early in the morning, but she hadn't shown up yet. 5 minutes later, Joe and Pam were leaving the house and walking to his car. As she entered, she noticed me and rushed over to me and hugged me tightly. She was going to kiss me passionately on the lips, but I instinctively turned away at the last minute. God, Frank, I love you. I specifically asked you not to do this. I even begged you not to do this if you remember correctly, and now look at the results. You seem to be turning into a man of bad character. Please, Frank, she pleaded, let's not let this get to us. This is in the past. We can go back to the relationship we had before. I've satisfied all of your desires, and that's all I want. I expressed my feelings. Pam, I love you. I pleaded with you to be faithful to me, but what did you do? You said coldly that my words didn't matter and that you would get whatever I asked for. Tears began to stream down Pam's face as she began to sob through her tears. She was still able to say, Frank, I really do love you. It's just that when I see Joe something stirs inside of me. But please don't do this, Frank. My love for you is genuine. I cherish the way you make love to me. But Joe continued to relentlessly occupy my thoughts. This isn't love, Frank, it's sheer fantasy. And as I looked at her, a wave of disgust swept over me as I looked at her. She pleaded with me, assuring him that her love was only for me, that it was you I really loved. Frank, let's get on with it. Let's act as if last night's night had never happened. But how can we go on ignoring the gravity of what has happened? Pam walks into the bedroom and collapses onto the bed, still in tears. But Pam replied, I'm so tired right now. I've barely slept today, maybe 30 minutes. I want to get some sleep and then take a shower before we talk. And she was already asleep. I couldn't risk making out with Pam until I was sure she didn't have a sexually transmitted disease. Walking outside and sitting in a chair on the lawn, I looked back at the house next door. I had to admit that I would be strongly tempted, so how could I put the blame on Joe? I had a question, and that question centered around Pam. Would I ever be able to regain her trust? In the end, I decided to stay and enjoy fishing with Bill and Carol, even though my heart was broken to begin with. With that settled, I went to the second bedroom to settle in for the night. It was obvious that I wasn't going to sleep in the same bed as Pam. Driven by curiosity, I went to the window and saw that Bill and Carol had finally arrived. I tried to suppress my emotions and put on an air of indifference as I walked toward them. I didn't want them to see how unhappy I was. Jane, this is my closest friend Frank. As she got out of the car, I couldn't help but marvel at her appearance. Hi Frank, nice to meet you, she greeted me. Hi Jane. Meanwhile, Carol came over from the other side of the car and asked where Pam was and what happened to your eyes. They look red and bloodshot. I didn't think she would notice so quickly and I hurried to come up with an explanation. I replied, it's probably because of the fresh air. I think I'm allergic. I told everyone that Pam wasn't feeling well right now, and the last time I saw her she was exhausted and asleep. Hey, guys, I need some help moving this stuff. She'll be sleeping in the bedroom directly across from the kitchen window. Maybe I'll get lucky like Pam. I used Bill. He came into the kitchen and put a couple of bags of groceries on the table. Grab your fishing gear, Bill. I suggested the girls could unpack while we went fishing. If they didn't mind, of course. Bill replied, you guys go ahead. Carol stepped in and we can organize things better. I went into the bedroom and Pam was still asleep. I shook her gently to wake her up. What's the matter, Frank? I said, if you don't want Carol to see you out of sorts you had better freshen up. Bill and Carol are here. Bill and I are going fishing and Carol will probably be visiting you soon, so I suggest you freshen up if you don't want her to suspect the cause of your discomfort. Bill started the engine and we started across the lake. At that moment I didn't care what happened to Pam, if she was embarrassed or humiliated. When Bill reached the other side of the lake he turned off the engine and I took control of the boat, paddling carefully so that we were close enough to the shore to cast slowly. By my calculations there was still about an hour to go before we returned, and Bill was the first to catch a significant fish, 19 inches long and weighing about 4 pounds, which he carefully put into the net and released into the water. It's hard to believe she's divorced. She looks much younger than her marital status would suggest. I'm sure he's been cheating on her since the day they got married 3 years ago. Wow, that's hard. I sympathize with her. Cheating on your partner can cause her great pain and suffering. Bill joined the conversation. He said she was a very attractive woman. I replied that there must be countless men who would want to know more about her. I'm sure the presence of a new romantic interest could distract her from her problems. I said that she seemed to have lost all faith in men and made a solemn promise to avoid them. But this vacation should bring her some comfort. Being away from home, immersed in the peaceful atmosphere of a lake, fishing and communing with nature might relax her and divert her attention to other problems. After an hour of continued fishing we caught a few more bass, enough to make a nice dinner. She offered to cook dinner for us and I agreed. While she started cooking I took a quick shower, freshened up and got lost in my thoughts. I calmly ate my food and thought about what I wanted to say to her and came up with the best way to express it. I think it's time to have that long conversation you were talking about, but before we get started I want you to know that my love belongs only to you. That last night was just a fleeting desire, a chance to fulfill an old fantasy, and that now it's all over and we can move on with our lives as if it never happened. That's your point. You think that all I have to do is forgive you and our relationship will magically be restored. It seems that you have no remorse for the humiliation and deception you put me through. You just think that forgiveness will fix everything without realizing how much offense and pain I went through last night. How can I trust you again after such a betrayal? I even thought you found pleasure in watching another man make out with me. Listen, Pam, I'm firm. I want to clarify one thing. I'm not like other men. I despise the idea of infidelity. If I suspected you of being with another man our marriage would be in jeopardy, and I haven't even decided on our future yet. Can you realize the gravity of the situation? I can say with certainty that we won't have any intimate relations until the vacation is over. Pam started to cry and she whispered, "Oh Frank, that's nice, but as I said, it's in the past and I'm deeply sorry for hurting you, and I promise it won't happen again. Please understand that if this happens again, our marriage will be irreparably damaged. You understand that, don't you? We can't go back to our old relationship because what happened will always be a part of our history, Pam, because it really happened, and I used to love you with all my heart, but now I'm not sure you have to return my love and trust with your unwavering loyalty." "I won't be happy about it," she admitted, "but I can try to understand your emotions." The next morning before dawn, I tiptoed into the kitchen to get a look at Jane's bedroom. I told her that if she was planning to go fishing with me then after sunrise she would probably be uncomfortably hot in her choice of clothing, but she said she wasn't interested in fishing and suggested I go alone as I tried to seduce her. I asked Pam if she would like to go with me to meet them, and she replied, "No Frank, these are your friends, not mine, and let them know that I am still not feeling well and would like to sleep today, and I intend to wait until I am sober to meet them." I said, "Since there isn't enough room on the boat for the 4 of us, why don't you take Jane with you?" She hadn't been fishing since she was a little girl, but her father loved to fish and Carol seemed to have inherited her hobby, but Jane had never shown much interest. I figured if she had experience with the old parabolic reels, she'd get the hang of it pretty easily. While we waited for the girls, we chatted and discussed places to fish. At that point, Carol and Jane walked down the path to the dock and Bill told them of our decision, and Jane suddenly burst out laughing, making fun of me for getting myself into some kind of trouble. As soon as Jane was aboard, Egan pushed us off the dock, started the engine, and steered us across the lake. I realized that I needed to concentrate on fishing and not let my thoughts wander to Jane, because I would undoubtedly embarrass myself in this situation, and the thought of Pam and the vague ache in my stomach made me sink into her behavior and her dismissive attitude toward them. She didn't understand the gravity of the situation, she just dismissed it as her own fantasy, But she didn't seem to understand the pain and humiliation I was going through. Maybe I should have looked elsewhere for a way out. Maybe I should have confused Jane by allowing myself to indulge in my own fantasies. As I considered the situation, an idea struck me. That's horrible. Bill and Carol are good friends of mine, and they would certainly not approve of my plan to manipulate Jane to get back at Pam, especially given Jane's recent difficulties with her divorce. In addition, if Jane found out that I was using her to get back at Pam, it would be grossly unfair to her personally, and she would probably hold a grudge against me. I laughed and explained that we didn't use live bait, just artificial bait, which we threw in and reeled back in. I quickly changed the line to a lure with a spinnerbait and demonstrated how to cast the line with this special reel. I explained that it sounded easy and she replied that she wanted to try it. She confidently made a hard cast but didn't release the line in time, resulting in a huge splash 5 feet from the top of the rod, and she realized her mistake. She started to wind the line with a different hand, but I quickly corrected her mistake. Spinning the rod requires winding it with your left hand, 0-0 position. Pause briefly to feel the whipping sensation of the rod, then smoothly move the rod forward to the 2 o'clock position, and as soon as the rod sits between 12 and 1, release the line from the forefinger. Okay, now try it again, and on her next attempt, she showed a slight improvement but released the line too soon, causing the lure to fly up 30 to 40 feet and land about 20 feet in front of her. Come here, I said, give her a seat, now put the lure in front of me. Now put your hand in mine and familiarize yourself with the technique, take a seat across from me. She leaned back and at that moment I felt an undeniable physical reaction. In order to keep her from feeling uncomfortable, I changed my stance in an attempt to demonstrate the range and accuracy of the cast. Her hair smelled ethereally of lavender, the feeling of her against my chest indescribable, and after a few attempts, she turned to face me, a wide smile lighting up her features. She laughed and rose from her seat and returned to the bow. Yes, she exclaimed, I think I understand everything now. She replied, I don't know what I would have done without Bill and Carol's constant support. They convinced me to come on vacation with them, even though I knew they wanted to be alone in one of these tiny houses and would limit their personal space if I was around them. We managed to throw our rods into the stream and caught 2 more good-sized bass. I offered to stop at the sandbar at the mouth of the stream so Jane could relieve herself under the nearest tree. After a while, she came back and told me that there was a hidden path in the trees that led away from the lake and along the stream, and out of curiosity, she asked me if I wanted to know where it led. We carefully moored the boat on the sandy shore and then walked through the dense foliage, Jane showing me the way, and when we had gone about a quarter of a mile along the creek I saw a grassy knoll in front of us. The lake was surrounded by a picturesque old-growth forest of old oaks, maples, and many birches with brown and white bark. As we both looked at the sewer, it occurred to me that this lake seemed to be rarely fished, so maybe the locals knew it existed. Maybe the locals knew of the lake's existence, as evidenced by the trail leading to it, but tourists and vacationers had hardly ever explored it. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she turned in my arms, her hands gently cradling the back of my head, and I was glad of it, she whispered, pulling me closer until our lips met. She admitted that I felt the same way, and I reassured her that Bill, you're out of a relationship and don't want to be involved with anyone else, not in the near future, probably not for a long time, and you know, that's really what she's saying, but for some inexplicable reason I don't know what to do about it. I think we should go back before something unpleasant happens and they might think we're lost or even drowned, and it's been about an hour, and it looks like we've missed lunch, and it's 2 o'clock, 00, and we're finally back at the marina. And on the way back I asked Jane to keep our discovery of the lake a secret from Bill and Carol, so that we'd cherish it as our own secret place. And Jane and I agreed to go on a weekend to go fishing, and she agreed. When we arrived at the marina, Bill was already waiting for us and said he was ready to get in the boat and meet us. Bill was really happy when we proudly showed off the fish we had caught, but admitted that he and Carol had not been very lucky. They had only snuck in a bass, which he told me Carol had caught in the boat. I hugged Jane and kissed her gently on the cheek and told her I really enjoyed our fishing and made plans to meet up later. When I got back to our house, Pam took her anger out on me. She looked at me piercingly and asked me where you had been. You were supposed to be back 2 hours ago. I saw you kissing her on the dock. You are always so impatient, aren't you? "I'll go fishing with you." To try to clear up the misunderstanding, I calmly replied to Pam, "You've got it all wrong. We're just going fishing. You're the one who's avoiding the others, not Jane. She's recently gone through a divorce and understands the pain and humiliation of a partner cheating on her. Our argument is over, and I've got time to cook and eat a sandwich." B. Carol and Jay have gone back out to the lake to continue their fishing trip and sit down outside on the sand with their beers, and drink at least a six-pack. The next morning before dawn, I looked out Jane's window again, hoping to see her, but my efforts were in vain. Instead, she insisted on going fishing with me and almost never left my side, depriving me of the opportunity to be alone. She followed me relentlessly wherever I went, especially when Jay was at my side. By Thursday night, I was so frustrated that I had begun to dream of going home, even though we had planned to leave on Saturday morning. I told him that Pam was struggling with deep self-doubt. Our conversation went on for a long time as we sat and drank beer and indulged in conversation, but I must admit I wasn't opposed to drinking too much, and eventually I blurted out some disturbing details about the view of Jane's bedroom from our kitchen window, and that Pam had witnessed something she shouldn't have been doing, and that it had led to some trouble. Although I didn't tell him the nature of these troubles, I think he guessed. Anyway, the last thing I said to him that night was to express my pleasure at our fishing together and my regret at having only caught one day's worth of fish. Jane stood in the bathroom, her body still wet from the glare of the fluorescent lights. We double-checked the house to make sure we hadn't missed anything, and then we went out to the car to get ready to leave, and Bill came out to say goodbye to us, and I asked him to pass on my thanks to Jane. As I drove home that day, my only thought was relief that the vacation was finally over, and the memories of the past week haunted me, reminding me that Pam had likely realized that everything had changed, and likely would for a long time. I barely said a few words on the 4-hour drive home, and honestly, that's exactly what I wanted. I realized that my love for Pam was at its lowest point, and as soon as we got home, one of the first things I did was go online and learn everything I could about sexually transmitted diseases. "Pam, you are the only woman I have ever truly loved and desired. That's why it hurt so much when I found out that you didn't feel the same way about me. Oh Frank, I'm so sorry I hurt you. You're the only one I've ever really loved. She was just a fleeting fantasy of mine, and I wanted her to understand that it's all over now." My feelings for her were so strong that before I left for work on Monday morning, I told Pam to make an appointment to see her doctor, making it clear that I would be going with her. The doctor told us that blood tests could detect any bacterial infections and that viral infections could show up within 6 months. The doctor recommended that Pam go to the hospital once a month for the next 6 months to have her blood work done. She made an appointment with us to get the analysis results in 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, we got a positive result that Pam was free of IAL bacteria and tested negative for STDs. Although Susie did not want to end the relationship, she admitted that she was not ready to marry him because she was not sure she would. Pam felt that Susie needed to discuss her feelings and make sure she was making the right decision before making a lifelong commitment. I asked her if she wanted something to eat or just a beer, and she chose the latter. Pam quickly grabbed a beer and took a seat in one of the easy chairs in the family room, and then she started talking about Susie and her boyfriend's various problems. For the next 3 weeks, our work schedules were much the same except that Pam started coming home after midnight. During the 4th week, I had a feeling of suspicion that prompted me to verify the truth of Pam's explanation. 00 Pam walked out the front door accompanied by another woman. They walked a few blocks into a charming restaurant. I curiously followed them and slipped unnoticed into the restaurant. As I entered, I noticed that their booth was located at the back of the hall. In order to maintain a certain amount of freedom of movement, I decided to sit in one of the booths across the hall so that I could watch them without being noticed by EAS. Meanwhile, my own waiter came over to take my order. I wanted to prepare myself a nice lunch in case they left suddenly, so I ordered a sandwich and a drink and watched them continue their conversation while enjoying their meal. I took the bill to the cashier to pay it, and just as I was about to leave, 2 men walked in through the door, and although I recognized one of them as Joe right away, the second one was still a stranger to me. Remained unfamiliar to me, and without a second thought they made their way to the card table while Pam and Susie were still enjoying their wine. Realizing this, I quickly paid the bill and headed down the street. A few minutes later, the 2 couples left the restaurant and quickly got into a brand new Buick sedan parked in front of the entrance, and before I had time to react, they drove away from the curb and disappeared. My car was parked 2 blocks away from the restaurant and I couldn't catch up with them, and as I was once again overwhelmed by the shock of seeing Pam and Joe, I felt like I was going to throw up and I desperately needed to find a place to sit down. Sitting there, I couldn't stop berating myself for not tearing up Joe's business card, but I reasoned that if Pam really wanted to cheat on me, she would have thought of something else. I managed to devise strategies that gave me a glimmer of hope for a brighter future, and now that Pam had gotten her wish, it was my turn to realize what I had been working so hard for. But surprisingly, I soon fell asleep and didn't wake up until the next morning, and I wondered when Pam had arrived home. She said yes, and I replied that it had been a long night, but especially hard. Would you like to discuss this? After getting his advice, I wasted no time and immediately purchased the best camera I could find, and when I got home, I immediately started looking for Joe's business card. Curiosity overcame me, and I began examining the underwear she'd left in the laundry basket, and to my horror, I discovered that the bottoms of the underwear were covered in dried-on stains, irrefutable evidence that confirmed my suspicions. On Tuesday night, Pam told me she was going to see Susie after work on Wednesday night. I chose to go for a classy look of black jeans and a form-fitting sweatshirt, grabbed my camera, and went to the nearest Subway store to pick up a sandwich and a refreshing Coke. 00 I went back to Pam's workplace, but this time I decided to stay in the car and followed them unnoticed as they left the building, watching their every move, and eventually they took me to the same restaurant they had been to the previous week. At that point, a shiny Buick appeared with 4 people in it. Joe, an unnamed man named South George, and a duo named Pam and Susie, and they didn't waste any time, they all got into the car and quickly left. Remarkably, this area was located on the other side of town, the exact opposite of our house. Eventually, their car pulled into a driveway where I assumed they were headed. Although the sun had begun to set during my journey, the darkness had not yet reached a level where it was safe to keep watch, so I waited in the garage for about 20 minutes before I finally worked up the courage to approach the house. The yard was overgrown with overgrown shrubs and bushes in desperate need of trimming, and it was obvious that Joe or George were not capable of keeping the yard in good order. I saw all 4 of them sitting comfortably on the couch, among them Joe and George. After making sure the flash was off, I carefully began to take some pictures. I needed to capture a nude picture of each of them and clearly identify them. I thought about it for a while and came to the conclusion that our marriage had undoubtedly come to an end and that I would never get another chance to forgive her. I sipped my beer and pondered what steps I should take to begin the divorce. Before I could get lost in my thoughts, a pretty young lady walked into the bar and started looking around as if she was looking for someone. She noticed that I was the only customer and approached my table. "I have a question for you. Are you a private investigator?" She asked me. "Oh no, I'm just a computer enthusiast," I grinned. "You see, I've been watching your every move since you left the house on Jefferson St. I even followed you to this bar, but I couldn't help but notice that you were taking pictures through the patio doors." "You see," she replied, "one of these men is my husband, and I feel remorseful." I hastened to apologize. "Oled, tell me, is your husband Joe or George?" She replied, "If you come with me we can do it now." After finishing the rest of my beer, I followed her out of the bar and into the parking lot where a spotless new Buick was waiting for me. As she pulled into the garage, I parked in the driveway, followed closely behind her, and followed her lead into the house, and was immediately greeted by a breathtaking sight. The interior exuded exquisite charm and was furnished with the finest furnishings that could only be purchased on the market. Joe must be a very foolish man to give it all up to take care of some other woman, and I said, indeed, she thought so, that Joe was a complete fool, who was foolish enough to think that he was God's supreme gift to a woman, and she told me at length, and she mentioned that her father was adamantly opposed to her marrying Joe. In addition, her father insisted on a prenuptial agreement guaranteeing that if Joe filed for divorce, he would be left with nothing. George's father was one of the wealthiest men in the city and owned the largest Buick dealership in the state, and as a favor, his father had given Joe a job at the dealership, and Joe in turn had helped George get a job there. Now that they were both facing unemployment, she doubted that they would be able to find new jobs because they didn't have enough seniority. After uploading all the photos, carefully selecting the best ones of each person to make sure they were easily recognizable, and printing them out. Liz asked how she would reward me for my help, and I told her that the fact of being divorced from Pam, and the fact that Joe and George had suffered a significant loss would be enough in itself to serve as retribution. I told them everything in detail, and they were appalled by Pam's behavior, and Bill offered to let me stay at their house for as long as I wanted, which I gratefully accepted. Time went by quickly, and now we had reached the day of our divorce. I never saw Pam, we only communicated through our attorneys. It has now been 2 years since Pam and I divorced, and I am very happy. I have a wonderful son, Paul, who is only 2 months old, and of course a wonderful wife. After Pam and I divorced, my friend got me and Jane to meet. He found out that she liked me and I liked her. We realized that our meeting wasn't by chance, it was destiny, and I'll tell you one thing, I'm very happy. And as for Pam, she's in a much worse situation. We had an intimate relationship after she cheated on Joe the first time, but I was very careful and protective of Pam, and 5 months later, Pam was diagnosed with the HIV. The doctor said this venous disease would manifest within 6 months. I also gave Pam's family pictures of her and Joe. Her father, a very strict and decent man, forbade all members of their family from interacting with and helping Pam. Pam was on the verge of an emotional breakdown, and she stopped coming to work, resulting in her dismissal. My interests were mainly related to reading books and playing video games, which made me even more isolated. It didn't help that I didn't have any siblings, even though my parents constantly urged me to participate in active recreational activities, play sports, and make friends. Our family was located on the outskirts of a busy city at a time when our small town was still booming, and many of the homes in our area were built on special projects. Unlike the homes in the suburbs, which usually looked the same, their busy schedules forced them to leave the house at 6 a.m. every morning and return home after dark, partly because we lived on a dirt road, and each morning I had to walk about half a mile to reach the school bus at 7 a.m. I had to walk to the school bus at 7 a.m. to get to the school, and I had to walk to the school bus at 7 a.m. Every morning I had to walk about half a mile to get to where the school bus picked me up at 7:30 a.m. One day when I was riding the school bus home, my neighbor suddenly pulled up next to me and offered me a ride. I thought it was a little strange because my house was so close, but out of friendship I decided to agree because I had seen his car parked at my neighbor's house and he looked a lot like my neighbor. He said he was an avid gamer when he was younger, but since then he has become passionate about active recreation, which is why he decided to move in with us at that time, when he was about 35 years old. As time went on, I didn't notice that my neighbor would unexpectedly come back from work and kindly give me a ride home when my boss dropped me off, and during these trips, due to my natural shyness, I was mostly silent and played the role of a silent listener. In addition, he talked about his upbringing and pretty much everything about himself, and he often talked about his longing for the quiet countryside where there was no noise to disturb him, in addition to his great love of his yard where he could barbecue and drink beer. At first, I thought that according to his sociable nature, the main reason he gave me a ride was because he wanted someone to talk to, but about a year later, when I was about 14 years old, my father gave me an expensive gift for Christmas, a night vision telescope valued at about $5,000, and my parents decided to buy a telescope because the night sky in our area was very dark and we could observe a lot of stars. In order for me to observe the sky not only through my computer screen, but also with the telescope on the top floor window, I was able to admire the stars from different directions or, depending on where the telescope was located around us, I could observe planets such as Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But as time went on and my interest in observing the stars began to wane, I decided to point the telescope at my neighbors' houses because most of them were one-story with fences around them and I could see into their yards and occasionally peek into their windows. 3 years old, his good friend Marcus often came to visit him, and before that he talked about Marcus, explaining that they worked for the same company and liked to spend time together on weekends, and that they used my night vision binoculars, and that I could make precise adjustments to observe the tiniest details of their faces, despite the distance between us. I observed a rather strange phenomenon when Marcus inadvertently touched my neighbor's wife's breasts as she averted her eyes. I noticed that she made an effort to remove his hand, but interestingly enough, she did not try to wrestle it away from him. the year-old son. Their behavior completely captured my attention, as I noticed that it was only when the neighbor's attention was distracted that he began these illicit touches, as if he were participating in a secret love game. Driven by curiosity, I made a hasty decision to install a recording device on the telescope and filmed what was happening. I carefully recorded everything that happened until my neighbor retreated back into the house and Marcus suddenly got up from his seat and began to make love passionately. Marcus hastily retreated as soon as he saw his neighbor return, and I was both surprised and shocked that he had taken such a risk. During this time I noticed that the neighbor's wife made no attempt to interfere or stop Marcus. It looked like she was actively participating and enjoying their illicit game. At that moment I felt no remorse or pity for my neighbor, even though I considered him my friend because of all the tricks he had been pulling for the past year. Marcus and my neighbor's wife were walking behind, and Marcus boldly put his hand up my neighbor's wife's skirt. I was struck by Marcus' boldness in blatantly exploring private places while being so close to his unsuspecting neighbor, and at the time, I didn't find their behavior offensive or disgusting. It wasn't until the following week, perhaps Wednesday, when one of the neighbors offered me a ride again, that I realized what a stark contrast there was between his joyful ignorance and the reality of his friend's intimacy with his wife. I sympathized with him but didn't dare expose the truth. On the way home, I was tormented by a sense of guilt as I experienced the emotional moment of witnessing my roommate being betrayed by his close friend. With my attention still focused on other things that day, I was too busy thinking about how to tell him the terrible news that his wife was having an affair with his close friend, and the weight of the revelation weighed on me so much that I had a hard time mustering up the courage to say the words. I remember him driving up to my house and waiting patiently for me to open the car door while I was still immersed in an internal struggle trying to find the right words to convey this painful truth to him. I tried to find the right words but was having a hard time coming up with coherent sentences, and he sensed my confusion, so he turned off the car engine and looked at me with a surprised look on his face and asked me worriedly how I was doing. I hurriedly opened the passenger door and ran to my front door, barely unlocking it and trying to find cover on the walls of my house, and after climbing the stairs, I looked up through the window and realized that his car was still parked on the same road where he had dropped me off. He had finally left, and it seemed like an eternity to me. I remember smiling now at this moment, how worried I was that interacting with people always made me feel incredibly anxious. The next day, as the school bus pulled up to where I got on, I silently prayed that I wouldn't run into my neighbor, but my hopes were dashed when I noticed his car waiting for me, which meant trouble was coming. It was absolutely unbelievable that he was waiting for me like that, and I wanted to walk away, but he called out to me, getting my attention, and I reluctantly got into his car, staring at the dashboard and trying not to look him in the eye. He asked me how I knew about the possible connection between them because he knew how special I was and how different I was from the other kids. In an attempt to clarify the current situation, I began to tell how my father had given me a telescope, and from my height I could clearly see his house, and I noticed that his family was in the backyard, and that there were some unusual signs around them, and that I was intrigued by their activities, and I began to watch them closely. At the same time, I decided not to talk about the fact that I was recording my observations because I was afraid of the possible consequences of such behavior. I was a very shy child, and my isolation would only make the situation worse. He quickly drove up to my house with rude obscenities in his words, and he wanted to hurt his wife and Marcus. Over the next few weeks he was absent from the places I frequented, and I kept looking for him with binoculars hoping to see him, but all I saw was his wife and son. He became a bit distant and less willing to talk to me. He did mention that he and his wife were getting a divorce, but I didn't ask for details. Now, 11 years on, I haven't changed significantly. I've become more sociable and have a real circle of friends, people who support you through difficult times. He got married again and started a new family. The idea of sharing my notes with him has crossed my mind, but I keep talking myself out of it. I'm thinking that it might bring back old wounds. I'm skeptical that it would really help, and I'm also thinking about whether or not it would be legal.